Um, I just first want to say thank you so much for having Natasha and I here. We're really excited to be here, and we've learned so much from you all. And don't be surprised if I took some of your nuggets to expand on with what I have been hearing. So my name is Shawn and I am a licensed master social worker. I live in Kansas City, Missouri, and I am the director of our support programs at the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, and I'm also their senior advisor in suicide prevention. And my colleague,
I'm Natasha Swayze. Real quick disclaimer, I turn red when I talk. I'll get all blotchy. Don't feel concerned. I know there's like a nurse in the room. You know, I don't want to think, oh my gosh, I'm going to pass out. And then you told me the story about the big gentleman that passed out after he got a shot. So I promise I'm not going to pass out. I've done this. I just turn red. It just happens. But I'm a licensed master social worker also and work with the Elizabeth Dole Foundation. I work alongside Shawn, and I work in doing the critical financial assistance for veteran families, specifically the caregivers. We use that program to empower our caregivers to be the ones to apply for the critical financial assistance.
Absolutely. So you all understand, we're going to give a little bit of background of the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, and that's actually part of our story, and I think it will make more sense to you. So we're going to talk about moral injury and veteran family caregivers, understanding, supporting, and advocating for those families. It's different. So some of the objectives, I want you to be able to identify some of the common triggers, which we've heard some of those, and manifestations of moral injury in those veteran family members, specifically caregivers, including emotional and those behavioral responses. You'll be able to identify interventions, which we've talked about, and treatments aimed at addressing moral injury in these veteran family members, including therapy, support groups, and community resources. We can't do it without our community. Then you'll be able to advocate for policy change and systematic improvement, which is, we all know, is very needed to better support our veteran family members. Again, those that are serving in that caregiver role, and those that are affected by moral injury, including the access to mental health services, like we talked about, and veteran support programs. So, the Elizabeth Dole Foundation. How did I come to the Elizabeth Dole Foundation? And it was about 2016. I really figured out, I did not know how to support my husband. My husband, I'm going to get that and jump ahead. But I needed a way to be able to best help my husband, but at the same time, how do I do that while I'm taking care of myself as well? And how do we find things? I happened to Google support groups and what was out there for veteran family members. There didn't happen to be anything in Kansas City, Missouri at the time. And I came across the Elizabeth Dole Foundation and their application to their Dole Caregiver Fellow program happened to be open, thank you, Lord, right at the same time that I needed it, and I applied. And from the get-go in 2017, when I became a Dole Caregiver Fellow, it all clicked for me. It opened up doors. I'm standing here today, that I would have never dreamed to even have. Senator Elizabeth Dole, she had a personal experience taking care of Senator Bob Dole. He was in Walter Reed for quite some time, and a woman of her faith, she looked outwardly and saw all the family members that were there taking care of their loved ones who were injured, and there was no support for them, none at all. So Senator Elizabeth Dole, being Senator Elizabeth Dole, did something about it, and she still does things about it. She was in her late 80s and is still doing things about it. One of the first things the Elizabeth Dole Foundation did was commission the RAND Corporation, to do a research project on veteran family caregivers. You all know if it's not in the research, it's not happening. And it was the first study specifically on veteran family caregivers. And which led her to starting the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, and she knew our stories, she lived it. She lived it. She knew our vulnerabilities and those sacrifices that would require a national response, not just one person. So, hidden heroes, that's what these caregivers are called. They're everywhere. But who are they? In that initial RAND report in 2013, it was found that there are 5.5 million military and veteran caregivers. The new RAND report comes out next week. It's embargoed, so I can't tell you what that number is right now, but just let me tell you that it has significantly. It's been 10 years since the first one. With that being said, there are also 2.3 million children living in these caregiving homes. So who are these hidden helpers? A lot of times we hear military spouses. Caregivers are not only military spouses. They're moms and dads. Think about our service members turning 18, 17, 17. Somebody was 17 and 18 going into the military. They weren't married yet. They got injured. They came home. Who was taking care of them? Their parents. So there's parents who are caregivers. There's siblings. There are adult children. So when we are talking about supports for military family, we oftentimes think of spouses. When you hear caregiver, you've got to broaden that, and we want to be inclusive and know that they are not only spouses. And for all of you in this space, you know that those supports for military spouses, there's more of them. There needs to be more. But think about those people who are caregivers that do not fit into that role of spouse, and there are not very many supports for them. I just want you to broaden your horizon when we say caregiver. What do they go through? I think you need to know what they go through before we get to moral injury. They are making some really big sacrifices, just as we have talked about that active duty military spouse making a ton of sacrifices. Our caregivers are making a ton of sacrifices. They feel very overwhelmed. They're not, some of them are, but most of them are not nurses by trade. And they're having to figure out how to do wound care. What do they do with prosthetics? Mental health care. Most of them are not mental health providers. How do they keep a veteran safe? How do they keep their loved ones safe? So they're very overwhelmed because they don't have that formal training. They become sick. They are at a higher rate of depression, more so than their civilian counterparts. They're alone. Many veterans isolate themselves. They live in rural areas, therefore they're isolating their families as well. They are facing a long journey. Many of these caregivers became caregivers in their 20s and 30s. This is different than most of the time in the civilian space. We say caregiver. What does that mean? You're caregiving for an elderly parent. These caregivers are caring from when they were 20 and 30 years old, and they are on a longer journey, a very much longer journey. They're financially strained. If someone had planned on staying in the military for their whole entire career, they got injured, ill, they got out. You all talked about spouses moving, their jobs aren't affordable. Imagine immediately having to get out of the military. They weren't working. Now that service member pay is gone, they have not connected with the VA. Well, they've connected with the VA, but it's a long process. So the pay isn't happening. So they're getting behind before they even can get ahead. Many, if they are working, they've had to quit careers. they stop going to school because they have to provide for the veteran, plus there's kids in the home that maybe now the veteran can't take care of because they're injured or ill. They are struggling. They do succumb to protracted emotional stress. Some caregivers experience distress 4 times at a greater rate than non-caregivers, leading to life-threatening physical issues like the diabetes, heart disease. It's different. It's just different.
And there also, I'd like to point out that 26% of caregivers experience suicidal ideation. More talking about mental health and the health and well-being of them.
Absolutely. That study was done by a colleague of ours, and some of her colleagues, Dr. Roxana Delgado out of Texas, did a study on suicidal ideation in military spouses who were taking care of veterans. And those that were taking care of veterans in the mental health space were at that 23.6 times greater chance of having suicidal ideation. And we don't talk about that. We talk about veteran suicide, but we do not talk about what these families are going through because of the injuries and illnesses of our veterans. We all know the definition of mortal injury, so I don't have to go into that. But let me go back a little bit on how I got to this place. Again, I didn't feel like I didn't have the skills to support my husband and his challenges. I was a police officer at the time when we met. I could come at it with that hat on, but who wants that in their house? Not many people do. And if you think about a police officer and a veteran of the military after 23 years in special forces, we kind of look like that. And so fast forward, we got married in 2015. By 2017, he had his first suicide attempt. I would say a very significant suicide attempt. And I had no idea. I knew something was terribly wrong that day. And what's interesting, our family was getting ready to go on a military retreat, our kids and Brian and I. So it should have been like, this was a great time. We're getting ready to go on vacation. He was mentoring at a local nonprofit for the day. So I actually thought he was safe. I went to work and left work because my daughter, my youngest, who is 13 now, but she was getting ready to start school and we were going to miss back to school night, meeting your teacher. She had some very high anxiety. So I knew I needed to get there and get that taken care of. So I left work, tried to get a hold of my husband, was calling him to say hello. Didn't get a text back. Then I called. He didn't answer, which was really, really odd. We always answered each other, even if we were mad at each other. He didn't answer. And I can still remember to this day where I was at, driving north on I-35 to go to my daughter's school. I can still feel the sun through the windshield on my car, getting that extremely horrible gut feeling, knowing that this day was not going to turn out the way that I hoped. I texted someone that I knew was there, former Navy SEAL, and he gave me the standby. I just wanted to know if my husband was still there. Went to the school. We were there for a good hour, came back out, and he still had not called me. One of my other daughters who brought my daughter to the school, I looked at her and said, hey, you're gonna have to take Peyton home. Something's wrong. Got back in my car, and the only thing that I could think of was, I don't know what to do from a life standpoint. Let me put the police officer hat on, and what would I do? Thankfully, by the grace of God, my oldest daughter had gone through some stuff, and I'm saying by the grace of God, because had I not, I would not have been able to find my husband that day. I could always track her phone, which meant track all of our phones. And that is the way I found him. So when I saw where he was at, in Dead End Road, no reason to be there. But I need to get to him pretty quickly. I remember texting a friend of mine. She goes, Shawn, you shouldn't go by yourself. I'm like, what are you talking about? I'm a police officer. And she goes, no, you probably really shouldn't. And I got to thinking, I'm like, okay, if this was a call for service, I wouldn't be going by myself anyway. So I made some calls, and I was mad at the time, but my friend that I did call, he's served in the police department with me. He actually was where my husband was at. And all I said to him was, my husband's in trouble, I need help. And he said, where? That's significant, because that doesn't happen very often. Oftentimes we don't get listened to. But all he said was, where do you need me? The great thing about that, I was, again, mad at the time. He went on in to the scene, so probably thank goodness I didn't have to see what way my husband was trying to check out the world at that point in time. But when I got there, I got the impact. And I remember vividly hitting my knees, and it was almost 2 years to the day that we got married.
Oh.
So, anywho, he obviously lived in 2017, but it was the beginning of, wow, this is really a very real thing in our household. To this day, I was a police officer that day. It wasn't a lie. Because people didn't allow me to be. They saw me as a police officer, that I could handle everything. I got to ride in the ambulance with him, which is a great thing. But because the ambulance driver and the other tech in the ambulance knew that I was an officer, they pretty much dropped off and left. And I sat there having to tell the doctor what happened, yet I didn't know everything that happened. So all that to say, that was the start of my advocacy in this space, how I really got involved with the Dole Foundation, how I got involved with other caregivers, and really the plight of what they are going through. I thought I knew what I was doing, but I really didn't. And anyway, we continued through our time. I wanted to get more involved with the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, which I did. I was still working on the police department. Hung on for a couple more years, and it was just getting really hard. And my husband would call and say, I need you home. And I'm looking at a group of guys going, hey, Sarge, I need to go home. And they're like, why? And I'm like, well, my veteran's not, what do you mean your veteran's not doing well? So it just got too much. So I left the police department in 2019, although went back to school and then went into social work, which is a total 90-day police officer. What does moral injury look like in caregivers? So we know it's commonly associated with veterans. We don't oftentimes think about, you were talking about military spouses, but we oftentimes don't think about the families being affected as well. And it deeply affects these family members. They may develop moral injury from witnessing their veterans suffering, feeling helpless to alleviate it. We do struggling with our own feelings of guilt and inadequacy in caregiving. Oftentimes, we're not standing up going, hey, I want to take on the role of caregiving. Oftentimes, we don't even know we're doing it. Especially as women, there are male caregivers, but especially as women, what do we do with our loved ones? We just take care of them.
And I think that's important too when we're considering the kids in the home. The 2.3 million kids that are in caregiving roles in veteran homes, that they're not being, I don't sit my girls down and say, hey, this is what you have to do. This is like your chores. They just know what to do based on behavior symptoms they've experienced with their dad. And that's not uncommon in the hidden helper space. So they're also just naturally, these roles are naturally just forming in the home.
Kids mimic us. right? They learn from parents. I can remember when my daughter was about 6 years old, I first heard her say, "Daddy, don't forget to take your meds." I didn't tell her to do that. She heard me, right? And so she takes that on, unfortunately, but they just do what they see.
Oh, yeah. Okay, common triggers of moral injury in veteran family members. The veterans trauma, and I'll go back to the last slide also. That moral injury, and for me personally, happens also when you have to leave an unsafe environment. Feeling guilty for doing that, feeling like you're the one that's breaking up the family. Kids are angry because, you know, how could you do this to dad, that type of thing. So having to deal with that. But I think that's an important piece because we know that domestic violence is high in this space. And so, and lots of caregivers do not leave the space because of how they feel like they'll be portrayed, like, you know, how could you do that to your wounded warrior, essentially. Okay, caregivers may frequently hear stories of their loved ones' traumatic experiences, which can have a secondary traumatizing effect. Helplessness, watching the veteran struggle with mental health issues, PTSD, or physical injuries while feeling powerless to alleviate their suffering. And I think this ties into going to the VA and advocating and not feeling like you're being heard, especially when the veteran's story can be significantly different than the caregiver's experience, but not, and the caregiver's experience is just as valuable, but it's not being considered in the treatment and care of the veteran. Self-blame, caregivers may feel they are not doing enough or failing to provide adequate care, which leads to guilt and self-reproach. And also being in this sandwich where you're taking care of kids, you're taking care of veterans, not veterans, actually, a veteran, and then taking care of, maybe I'm thinking like my two ex-husbands, but they're,
And she's doing it again.
I feel like you have a bus, like driving, you know, taking everybody to their medical appointment, but, but also this, and then you have aging parents. So you're all over the place being a caregiver in these different roles to these people that need you in different ways. And so, the guilt of that, like, gosh, my poor kids, I'm not giving them attention because dad's over here and really, you know, needs whatever they need, or mom, or what have you. And then witnessing decline, seeing a loved one deteriorate physically or mentally can evoke deep moral distress. Going back to that, you know, we know dementia, ALS, higher in our military veteran communities. An example, a caregiver who feels that no matter how much they do, they can prevent the veteran's depression or suicidal thoughts may start to believe they are morally responsible for the outcome. And we see this so much in the work we do and in our financial wellness programs. Caregivers, they don't feel like they can work. And some of them can't because of the type of care they're providing. Some of them, I wish they would let us show them the way, because they could, if the will's there, they really truly could, which would improve their financial situation. But they have that responsibility of keeping that veteran alive has been put on them. Now, it may have been put on them by themselves. Sometimes we hear that the veteran puts that responsibility on, you know, like, if you leave me, I'm going to do this. This will be the result. Sometimes our systems of care and our providers put that responsibility on the caregiver. So that's a huge one we see in our school. You want this to one? Yeah. Okay. And there you are. I love this picture of Brian.
Oh, that's a great picture.
Yeah, it's my favorite picture of my husband and I. So one of the things that you said, Annette, when you were presenting, so this is supposed to be an example, but it's a real life example. So if I came to you, let me well, I already said all this. So if I came to you and you were my provider, and I said, I just lost my husband to suicide, who was a veteran, and I'm not doing well, and my kids aren't doing well, I don't know how to support them. And you immediately jump on, she's in grief, and why wouldn't she be? You stop right there, you're only going to see that I'm going to agree. If you get the further picture, that I was a former police officer and I was an officer for 15 years, I responded on calls like that. Stop calls like that. Go further, I'm a social worker. I know the signs and symptoms of suicide. I know what to do. But after 10 years, multiple times that I did stop them, the last time I couldn't. Shouldn't I have? I was a police officer. I was a mental health professional. Why didn't I can go down that lane? Sometimes I do. I snap it off pretty quickly because I know that's not true. But how many people don't know that's true? So is it greed? Or is it moral injury? I should have been able to stop. I absolutely knew the writing was on the wall. And I knew what was going to happen when he took off. Because he did the same thing. The pattern was there that he had done multiple times. Yet this time, we weren't home. We were out of state. And he didn't have his car. So everything that I had put in place to track him, one, he got smart and knew that, not that he wasn't smart, but he figured out how I was tracking him. And I had no idea the landscape and where we were at. And then I had to leave to go back home because am I supposed to tell my 13-year-old on the phone that daddy's missing? No. So I had to go home knowing that more than likely he had died by suicide before I even got the phone. I just like the lady that presented earlier was not, yes, I am not unique. This is what's happening in our caregivers. And we're being put in these spots to keep veterans safe. Most people aren't police officers and mental health professionals. They don't even know the signs and symptoms. They don't know who to call. They don't know what to do. Yet, many of us are in the VA caregiver program and we're expected to do that. We're expected to keep our veterans safe, yet we're not being taught how to do so. And really, in the end, 7, that's what we're putting on these families. There's no way possible that we can keep our veterans safe 24/7. They're just listening. But that is one. We obviously did not know that our camera person was taking a picture at that time, and we had just talked out of the church. That's fun. But this journey to caregivers to survivor, not only do we have moral injury when we're a caregiver, but I think it really kicks in from the caregiver to survivor piece when we sit here and go, did we do enough? Did we do enough? These emotional responses, guilt. Did I let him down? Did I not caregive well enough? Shame. Internalizing that belief that we're bad because we could not fix our veteran. When my husband and I met in 2013, he said, I have PTSD, I'm a recovering alcoholic, and I live with my parents. Yeah, I know what strikes me, and I'm like, oh, and you said you didn't have a job. I'm like, you've got something here. But my first reaction was, fix all that. Right? As women, men are laughing because women think that we can do that, right? Women are nodding their heads because you're like, yes, we can fix all that, that's what we did. Right? But I quickly realized that I could not fix all that. But I think that's a message that we need to make sure that we're giving these family members. We can't fix this. We can empower family members, but we cannot put this huge burden that we can make sure that all the mental health challenges that our loved one is having, we can fix it. Yeah, there's shame there. There's guilt. There's anger. I'm angry at the system. I'm angry that they didn't listen. Living most part 24/7.
And I love that, we talked a couple of years ago, I did an anger management class for probation and parole, for the state of Missouri. But my fascination was anger and really that, no, it's not, what is that? What's that other emotion that's below that anger? You know, the anger is the iceberg. What's all that floating under? And so it really gives you a different lens to show people grace when that anger does, you know, that lid flips and they're like, and I'm really bad at that. I'm a, you know, like the veteran that I was, my ex-husband, he'd go here and I'm like, oh yeah, well, I can match you, I'm going here. So it was like a, you know, race to the top. But I just, yeah, I just love to make sure we show people grace when that anger is being, it's coming out and it's like, there's something below there.
I think for caregivers, one of the things that we can feel is in this moral injury space is being let down by the systems of care, especially when we are being blamed for the situation. I don't know how many times my husband went inpatient. Mind you, I met him when he was being medically discharged. So I wasn't with him during that time. Didn't know him when he was a kid. And he had childhood injuries. He had combat trauma. Yet when none of the modalities were working with my husband, then it was a relationship.
Marital.
They
like to call it marital.
Actually, that was in his records. We had marital discord. That actually happened after we sought out counseling at the VA. But because that was put in there, then I was looked at differently.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Like the victim.
Yeah. Or I was the reason for his suicidal ideation, right? The last couple of years when he went into inpatient care, the first thing they asked was, how's your relationship? Well, absolutely, it sucks right now because my husband has attempted more times than I can count. And we all know in the research, it affects families too. But I wasn't the cause of it. But I was made to feel it. So many caregivers will take that on and think that they are the reason.
Which then goes to affecting their mental health. And then, of course, if they are connected to the caregiver program, they can't go to their caregiver, to their coordinator and say, hey, I'm struggling, because then what happens? Well, how can you be a caregiver if you too are struggling, right? So it's like you have to be isolated, you have to keep it all in, because you can't say that hey, I probably should be inpatient myself, but, you know, then it's like, what, yeah, so it's really isolating and, it feels like you have to stay private and then of course, you know, then you have the kids who need therapy and all that, but then, oh my God, you're scared to death, like, please don't tell. Here's a example of moral injury too. That I think I'm gonna go back and get my own therapist after this because I've really been enlightened and inspired by you all that I remember. Now, mind you, I'm a social worker, right? So I should probably know right from wrong with a lot of things and how to handle children. But I remember telling my small children before they went to therapy, you cannot tell them that your dad's putting holes in the wall. You cannot tell them that this is happening. And so they're not, I know they need care, right? Mental health help. But I know it's wrong that I'm telling my kids, like, you can't say this. When your therapist should be a safe person, you should just be able to tell them everything. But I was scared to death to get hotline, which did happen before. So it's just this, you're kind of feel screwed either way, you know, where you want care, but it's like you still gotta hold these family secrets, so to speak, right? Which causes some major moral injury, yeah.
Just wait till we do all our therapy by AI, it'll all be better.
Yeah, that's right.
So a couple of points that she made that I want to expand on. Many other caregivers will not tell their caregiver coordinator at the VA that they are struggling because they get a stipend monthly. And that stipend is going towards their financial, their bills and what have you in their household. Even though we're told not to put it towards that, the economy today, they're not working. Maybe that veteran isn't at 100% yet. Maybe they're not retired. So they're not making the money. So they're not stepping out and saying, I need help too, because they're fearful that that stipend will be taken away. In regard to the children, again, my husband had some substance use alcohol problems, and he actually picked my daughter up drunk one day from school. I was actually in town, so he could have called me. Yeah, I'm sure he just didn't want to tell me. I came home. I knew right away that he was intoxicated, and it hit me. Oh my gosh, he just picked up my daughter. And I immediately said, you've got to go to care. You need to do care. We're leaving. When he told the inpatient folks that that's what he did, and that's the reason why I was there, they called me. You know, we're mandated reporters. I'm like, you've had the problem. Where's it now? I got nothing. So if you're going to call them, you send them to where you're at, not me. But if we're putting all that blame on these caregivers, what do you think?
Right.
What do you think? What do? They withdraw, just like she said. They overcompensate. I was extremely hypervigilant after my husband's first suicide attempt. In fact, I stayed home for 3 months. I got to where I exhausted all FMLA. I was getting no pay, which, by the way, my police department didn't call it.
Well, and that's a whole thing, right? Is these people who you trust, right? That she calls her brothers and sisters, and they're supposed to have your 6, and you're at home. It's like, well, what are you guys thinking? I'm not the one that did it, so I'm okay. But you know, like, didn't think that through very well, right? Yeah.
So I think some of us come at moral injury also before we get into this space, right? And if we're not asking the right questions, we don't know the background of those that are in us. So there are more things. The hypervigilance, for me, I didn't want him to leave the house. I didn't want to leave the house. For fear if I left the house and come home and he would have attempted again. For fear if he left, he would attempt again. So that hyper vigilant caregiver who's trying to fix everything, yet they can't. You're just putting burdens on them that are taking them down a path that now they're trying to climb out. And for those of us who aren't in that space, just like Natasha said, her being fearful of the counselor calling DFS, it's because they don't understand the military culture.
And you should know better, you're a social worker, what, and being forced one time when things got really bad, packing up my teenager, my toddler, my newborn baby, and being forced out of my home to a women's shelter. And they allowed him to stay home, but and threatened to take away my kids. And I'm not the one that broke the windows out of the house, put holes in the wall, but I was one forced out of the house to a women's shelter with my teenager, toddler, and newborn baby. And, had to sleep on a cold cot, type thing. So that blame, like, well, I'm not the one that did this, and you're threatening to take away my kids, but I didn't do it, so. And it's not, again, not unique, it's so common. Yeah.
And what do they turn to if they can't go and get help? Substance use. There are many who numb, just like veterans numb their pain with alcohol, other substances. The psychological impact, just by being a caregiver, they are at a 40% higher rate to develop depression than their civilian counterparts. Just because they're taking care of each other. They have PTSD-like symptoms, that secondary stress is real. They may experience flashbacks, nightmare, anxiety triggered by the veteran. My husband and I, when we first met, we actually triggered each other. I thought I had it all together. I had to go back to counseling. I apparently did not during my 12 years of being single.
Well, and I can say I did the same, because I didn't know what I did. Now, again, he probably was a jerk in a lot of ways, but I thought he was an extra jerk for the behaviors. But I also didn't understand what he was going through. So I had no type of compassion. I just thought I was dealing with a jerk, which wasn't necessarily the case. He's actually a great dad. He's doing a lot better. But I didn't know what he was dealing with. So you put that together and Mama Bear, and you have one ugly situation.
So all this to say, we can't just treat the veteran. I always say that I could ruin his great therapy day. So all the work that a provider sat there and did, if you are not giving me psychoeducation, if you're not checking in to make sure, do I need mental health care as well? Do we need marital care? Marital care where you're not blaming one or the other, or saying, now, he has PTSD. So, if you're treating a veteran, if you have veterans, make sure that you're checking in on that family, giving them the options. A lot of the same modalities, that's what you talked about. Family needs it too. We want to holistically support the entire family, so these families are divorcing, suicide, homelessness,
Domestic violence, yeah. I really truly believe that a holistic approach to family care will lower all of those.
Yeah.
Make sure that you get these family members, these caregivers, to peer support. It is one of the best things. We know that in veterans, with family members, these caregivers, that has carried me through the last 10 years.
Wow.
That all the resources that I found was not through providers. It was through other caregivers that had been there before me. That's how I learned, right? Yes. So it is for the caregivers as well. We need to make sure that we are providing space for them too. Anyone who has organizations, they treat veterans, is there one more thing that you may be able to do, which is bring in that family member? We can have their space over here, the veteran can have their space over here. Do you know how many times I've seen only organizations supporting the veteran and that caregiver family member never gets anything? Peer support, the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, this is Natasha and I do mental health months, restorative weekends. These are all veteran caregivers having the time of our life. You got us nowhere at the end and not crying in that picture. But the Elizabeth Dole Foundation, the Red Cross Military and Veteran Caregiver Network, and the Survivor Space TAPS. The VA does have some great programs that a lot of times these family members actually don't know about, even providers sometimes don't know about. You've got to offer not only in person, but online groups. Again, these caregivers are isolated. They may not be near in-person support. Many of them are not, and or they can't leave their house or leave kids there. So then they're not getting support. It has to be virtual as well. We did some great things virtually. Yes, we love in person, but there's got to be that virtual component as well. Know your community resources. Because, I mean, we all know moral injury, my husband, none of his providers in 10 years ever got moral injury. Ever. He was very treatment resistant and everything that they had tried. If we know that's the case, we really know that we're not paying attention to military spouses and veteran family caregivers.
Because he brought it up to them. I mean,
I did bring it up. So you all who are supporting veterans also need to know the resources. What are the resources for these family members? They're different. A lot of times they're different. And you also need to find programs that the veteran doesn't have to sign up for them first. Because some veterans don't want to sign up for help first.
It looked like they were all women. Do they have
we have,
male
We have,
caregivers?
yes.
Do
We
you?
have been
Oh, that's
yes. And actually in the Dole Caregiver Fellow Program, we have many men in as fellows. And it's really neat when you get them together because it's a different perspective just coming from the male versus female, but it really died.
yeah.
It is really neat. And the other thing that we need to remember, a lot of caregivers are also veterans. Right? So we need to be asking that as well. Most of the time, the females that came to our restorative weekends, if they were a veteran, they would not know.
Yeah.
I get that, it being in the first responder space, but it's an issue, right? That's another identity I want to talk about my service. The VA Caregiver Support Program, know your community resources so you can refer these families to care. Operation Family Caregiver through the Rosalind Carter Institute, local mental health services. One of the big things that I am really big in, Natasha as well, making sure that we provide cultural competency training to local providers who just aren't in this space. If you don't know, you don't know. And then the nonprofits and faith-based organizations like Reboot Recovery, which is out of Texas. They have a trainer model. They have programs for first responders, veterans, and then they have a trauma reboot that we use for caregivers. It's faith-based. It's amazing. Get something out of it every time we facilitate it. We have an hour. And NAMI offers some really great resources for families. They have a NAMI Homefront program, which is specifically for family members of veterans and military members, it is great psychoeducation. You cannot put on a family member, help this veteran with PTSD, TBI, anxiety, depression, without knowing what to look for. I mean, we don't know what we don't know. If they've never been in this space before, look, I didn't know what I didn't know when I first came into it. I had no idea what's it like. Right? I mean, and some of us came into this space after our loved one got out of the military. So we don't even know who did, but some don't know any of the acronyms. They don't know the systems of care. We have to be providing that for them, empower them in their relationship with their veteran. Advocate. Advocacy is big in this space for caregivers. There is a lot of things that need to happen legislatively. Mental health care is needed, and it's not readily accessible by caregivers. Remember, not all the family members have health insurance. Many don't. Even if the veteran is connected to the VA, if they're not 100%, their family is not getting mental health or health care. So where do they go? That's the policy, that's the advocacy that we need to change. And if they do have mental health benefits, insurance, we know they don't pay very well, right? What if they have themselves and 2, 3 other kids that need to be in care as well? They are not going to be afford, for the most part, those co-pay. Again, it's the lack of knowledge or availability out there. I see time and time again. Many providers who take TRICARE are stopping because of the system. They don't get paid. They don't get reimbursed enough, and or it takes long. Why? Why aren't we telling our legislators that this needs to be changed? Veteran support programs need expansion. Right now, the VA caregiver program, we are waiting for a bombshell to drop. And many of these caregivers are waiting for that bombshell to drop because many of them are going to be kicked out of the program. Those of us that were caring or are caring for veterans with mental health challenges, it's really hard to prove that safety and supervision piece. I mean, if I'm caring for someone who has physical injuries, it's really easy to see. I need to provide wound care. I need to push said person in wheelchair, get them upstairs, get them out of bed, right? Those ADLs versus IADLs. These caregivers are expecting to be kicked out of this program, which what is that going to do? The system didn't provide support. The system didn't take care of them. As a survivor, I got one phone call. In 6 months, I haven't heard anything. And they dropped me off because they passed away. Did he suicide? Even though he was in their care for 10 years? Legislation. We are right now advocating for the Senator of Federal 21st Century Veterans Health Care and Benefits Improvement Act, which goes into the larger omnibus bill, which people may not get paid if they don't pass it pretty soon. These are veteran survivors. These are veterans. It's caregiver pay. Advocacy is huge. So Senator Dole said, the best chance for a wounded warrior to recover and thrive is having a strong, well-supported caregiver. We're there to the thick and thin, the family members through the active duty stages. They transition to. And
a couple of caregiver to survivor transition that happens very often. And
that identity. The identity loss. We know that happens in veterans, right? Happens in these spouses, the caregivers, everything is going to end. And that's why we try so hard to make sure that they're not identifying solely as caregiver. That's another way that we can empower these family members. Because if I wasn't looking, if I didn't have this passion for this community, if I wasn't in this space and I lost my husband and I lost my identity, if that was my only identity, who would I be in there? I'm not caregiving anymore. Who needs to? And then that leads into more issues with our caregivers. And I didn't even touch on kids. But in these households, our kids.
When they're experiencing the same mental health challenges, physical health challenges.
My youngest daughter is having a really tough time. And she saw her dad find a way to deal with his struggle. How do we make sure that that's not what our kids are going to do when we do know that these kids are at a 3 times greater risk when they have a parent die by suicide for them dying by suicide? Really heavy burden. And one of that burden is, should I have left a long time ago? So she wouldn't have been in this spot? More wondering? Clear in the thinking. The call to action. Reflect on your role in both supporting affected caregivers and advocating for necessary systematic change. And I know each one of you in your spots in this great big wide world, just don't just think it's only about the veteran. Check my LinkedIn out and you'll hear even more things from me. But one of the things I did right after my husband passed away, because a lot of times all I hear, or all I've heard was, we gotta treat the veteran, we gotta treat the veteran, we have to treat the veteran. Someone took a picture of 2 of my kids at his flag draped casket. And I put on LinkedIn with that picture. Is that only about the veteran? That's it. Those are heavy, but please. Don't just look at the veteran. Yes, I'm not saying veterans aren't important as well. But we have to look at the family and these kids as well. Thank you so much.